Novell bought some, Sun bought Netscape and its identity management and its directory service. They're also providing out-of-the-box federation capabilities. I'm not sure if anyone here has worked with some of these, but there are SAML hooks. There's WS security and SOAP messaging in a lot of the Tivoli products. There's almost every one of these technologies providing some type of hook out to a federation of some kind. And again, they see it as middleware. They're starting to actually make product lines that are dedicated to this. That was unheard of 3 years ago. You heard about it in their labs. You know, whether you were in Austin for IBM and you were hearing it, they're trying to consolidate it into a product line. And I think one of the interesting things there is there's two different rules of thought there that we're going to talk a little bit about in the access management area. One rule of thought is I need to control your enterprise. I need to put agents on all these machines. I need to touch everything in order to be effective at identity management. There's another school of thought that says I just need to be a resource and I need to talk to these different things, whether it's from the top down or from the bottom up. And both of them have their pluses and minuses. You'll see organizations like BMC and a lot of the big management vendors, BMC, CA, Tivoli, they'll start out with one and then they'll do the other type. You'll see the other type of application type vendors, whether it's Oracle or Novell not Novell, but Oracle or BEA or IBM. They'll come at it from a different angle where they're providing a service to the service-oriented architecture that they really don't care about managing your systems. We'll talk about two approaches in access management that'll make that a little clearer. I'm going to talk a little bit about history, continue, and talk about how I've seen a very good model of this. It's going to come up in a second, and I'd like to share that. And here's the model. This came from Ping Identity Corporation, and I find it very effective at talking about how this all came to be. And they use the term silos of identity, which I like. Back in the early 1990s, I think one of the first network operating systems I worked on was Novell. A lot of the other, and this was Novell NetWare. This is nothing what it looks like now with NDS and the big directory services that they do now. This was basically just and it was also tied to the protocol. So Novell was very much tied to IPX, and then all of a sudden in 1994, you have Windows, what they called at the time, New Technology Advanced Server NTAS, and it became Windows NT. And that was the first one to really apply itself past the NetBIOS type internal LAN structure out to TCP/IP and into the wide area network. Otherwise, it used to be that you had two separate networks. When I worked I actually worked at the National Institutes of Health. Early in my career, we had two networks. We had the LAN, and then we had what we reached out with the Gopher and the WAST searches on the internet. So you actually had to run two protocols on your box all the time. It was a very interesting time to be a network engineer. It was with broadcast traffic reaching out over IP networks. It was not a lot of fun. You move in the late 90s, about the time I started doing some directory services work, we were moving into centralized identity. So the thought became, you know what? I'm sick of having passwords, user accounts everywhere. I can't manage them. It's a risk to my company. As an IA person, I need to centralize everything. And that really was okay, and it had a lot of traction for the time period that you talk about here, until you started, and that was okay as long as you had centralized applications and your house was controlled. You had a perimeter, and you had things that were inside the perimeter, and rarely did you reach outside the perimeter for significant data sharing. So we all started to centralize. We all started to do things like meta connection tools, where we were moving data from separate directories into a single directory, and at the first part of that, we were actually migrating away from those directories. So we would consolidate and then stand down those other directories or those other databases that carried user information. That only lasted for a while for various reasons. A lot of it has to do with politics and business control. A lot of it has to do with structure. Some of it has to do with wide area networks and having to reach across a network for identity. I've seen this specifically when you're reaching across a network with a less than an ISDN line and you're trying to do Active Directory replication. It's not pretty because Microsoft kind of assumes that you have a well-connected network, and in that term, they usually mean a T1 or better. So you're trying to span this thing and trying to replicate out a directory structure that's huge for a corporation. You eat up 80% of your bandwidth just trying to replicate. So it became, okay, well, we've got to develop these trust models, and that's, I think it came out somewhat prematurely and caught folks off guard, but they took the real directory models, the forests. Anybody here developed an AD forest? You have forests and you have trees, and there are various levels that you talk to each other, various levels of trust, and it's interesting that all that really is based, or it can be based around geography, it can be based around politics, but really what it's usually based upon in that model is network bandwidth, is trying to make sure your replication strategy reaches the endpoints and that you're not missing things that you need, whether it's directory attributes or information about a user that an application requires. That can become a real management headache. So centralized, it works sometimes, and it still does work sometimes. There's usually an enterprise directory in an organization, and that can be a human resources database. I see our distinguished CISO here laughing about that. That's something that is a lot of fun to deal with. And normally it's not even a directory. It's usually a database about things that other people will rely on. That's the simplest way to explain it. So now you move past the internal enterprise and identity management into internet scale identity. And this is where I need to share information with a provider. They're going to house it for me and give me a really good price point if I can reach out with some of my data across the internet space. And as bandwidth came up and as the internet became a more reliable and more commercialized entity in the late 90s, I kind of disagree with the model a little bit because it overlapped. There was probably a time in about 2000 where people started scratching their head and going, "Gee, how am I actually going to deal with this when I have to talk to another organization, another company?" E-commerce back in the .com days drove this really strongly. They're like, I need to do I have one company doing customer relationship management. I have another company doing inventory. I need to actually get that data real time back and forth. So what you saw was the development of identity, synchronization, identity queuing, all these other types of peripheral technologies. That actually, then somebody figured out, okay, well, I need to standardize that. Otherwise, we're going to be talking about 70 different languages, and no one's going to be effective at this, and it's just going to miss the mark. So you have the folks from the Oasis folks. You have the Liberty Alliance folks who started to come up with standards for this somewhere around, I think it was 2000. They started, and I have dates in here for when they were actually delivered. So I've already talked a little bit about isolation of identity. I really think, even to this day, I was involved in a lot of Novell to Windows NT migrations in the late 90s, and to this day, I think Novell's big problem there was not actually their directory services are a fine product. It was their focus. They just did not know how to focus on the next level, the things that they needed to care about, the federation of identity. They just didn't see through that, and they played in the LAN space too long, and they got overtaken by Microsoft. And they still have a great directory services product, but it is much more service-oriented, architecture-based, and I really do believe that they're very, very good at that. And the domain login and trust. I remember when I was back in the 90s when I was getting my Microsoft certification, a lot of non-IA people really struggled with the concept of a domain. And to this day, it is impossible to try to explain that, because now that's focus, when you say domain to an IT person, they generally think Windows 2000 or Active Directory or Windows NT. They do not think a security domain, a perimeter, a zone of trust, something that you know the rules on and something that you can assert the rules on. That's what it really was back then. You had trust models, you had one-way trust, two-way trust. All that is basic, IA competency. It's all things security folks learn. In my case, I learned it very early on. I was in the military and learned it in ComSec school. But you try to explain it now, and it's like, what do you mean? Do you mean I get that probably weekly. Do you mean a Windows NT domain? And I just look at them and go, no, not really. I just mean something that you can trust, something that you know about. I talked a little bit about centralization. Account lockouts and forgotten passwords across the enterprise began to cause losses. If there is a silver bullet for an identity management and provisioning project